I couldn't blame anyone who might have yawned at Nintendo's announcement of the NES World Championship in 2024. It's a product that truly embodies the stagnation of the official retro gaming market. Now, I say that as a big retro fan, but it's time to move on. Not because old games are inherently unappealing. On the contrary, many of the biggest 16-bit classics remain peak 2D gaming. Even the NES library, despite 8-bit games being a much tougher sell for casual gamers, has a couple of timeless classics, particularly when it comes to side-scrollers like Mario 3 or Contra and Mega Man 2. But we've been seeing this same exact batch of NES, Super Nintendo and Mega Drive games rehashed over and over again for multiple decades now. Ironically, they've been milking these ROMs for so long that people might actually be nostalgic for ROM dumps that came out on Wii U or PS4. This doesn't make some of these games bad, but there's not much more you could do with something like the NES. At least in the realm of what publishers like Nintendo are willing to do. Atari was a little more innovative with their 50th anniversary collection, which was designed like a virtual exhibition. Small interviews and documentaries give insight into the history of their games, which can be played like digital exhibits. While the NES Championship with its micro-sized challenge modes also goes beyond a simple port dump, it really isn't that fresh, as it's more of a rehash of the NES Remix, which came out a decade prior, or of WarioWare and the Game Center CX collection, which are both another decade older. At this point, GameCube or even Wii games being remixed would make for a much more refreshing and even nostalgic experience, because I'm sorry, the era of PS2, Xbox and GameCube is retro now. I mean, it's a quarter of a century old. Even the age of PS360 is bordering on retro. Really think about where you were when these consoles came out and what else was popular. Yet countless hidden gems and classics very much deserving of finding new audiences are falling through the cracks when it comes to legal and easy availability for games, especially after the 16-bit era. Not to mention that the games that are officially brought back are often released in a dire state. You could argue that retro gaming services by big publishers are not just stagnating, but even regressing. On Wii in 2006 there were well-emulated N64 games for download, and in the end there were over 400 games from a multitude of machines, from N64 to Neo Geo, in the Wii shop. After that, each Nintendo console would have a smaller and sometimes inferior retro catalog. On Switch, N64 games launched with drastic slowdowns and missing basic graphical effects. Other companies didn't fare better. Many remasters, such as the GTA trilogy, were released completely broken. I remember how people thought that all the PS2 HD collections on PS360 back in the day were a rip-off, but today they'd feel like a blessing, because many more older games were available and emulated and remastered with strikingly higher quality. It was a decent surprise seeing Sony dropping a new PS2 emulator on PS5 with Sly Cooper, but we've already had a remastered Sly trilogy at some point, a God of War collection. A decade before the Metal Gear Solid remasters of 2023, the PlayStation 3 Metal Gear Legacy collection contained like twice as many games, which at the same time ran better. It certainly isn't impossible to give older 3D games justice and make them appealing to newcomers. Not only proven by developers like Night Dive Studios, responsible for many great 3D game remasters, especially in the shooter genre, but also by the hacking scene. Dedicated fans have long gone beyond simple emulation. Old games running with widescreen, much better performance and even graphical improvements like ray tracing. Yet, instead of embracing those efforts, publishers rather sue them and deliver their own solutions which are inferior in both functionality and quantity of games. Companies keep charging more money, but their retro efforts decrease in quality. It feels like they rather handpick an extremely small number of nostalgic games to fully remake from scratch, which, if done well, can of course be delightful. I might actually prefer the Resident Evil 2 remake to the original, which as a fanboy wasn't easy to admit, but as good as that remake was, it's simply not the same game. Different gameplay, different map layout, different music, art direction and so on. It's literally an entirely different experience. But the original still remains a masterpiece of its era and doesn't deserve to be pushed out of official availability. Perhaps this goes back to the narrative that people couldn't possibly enjoy 3D games before the PS4 generation in their original state, which I would disagree with. It doesn't hurt to improve some classics like Devil May Cry 3 or Final Fantasy X with skippable cutscenes or assignable buttons, shorter loading times, etc. But most true classics from this era should still play fine enough to enthusiast gamers, even just upscaled without new features. Put them in a nice collection so people can refrain from going through the hassle of loading up modded versions on PC. Capcom's catalog of 2D collections is nice, for example, but I think at this point no one's gonna have a problem finding a way to play Mega Man or Street Fighter. Yet fully remaking a niche PS2 and GameCube game like Beautiful Joe will never be profitable to Capcom, despite still being a unique hidden gem that deserves to be played by more people interested in the history of this industry. Which all begs many questions, like where's the Capcom 3D collection? Where are the GameCube championships? When will Sega move on to a Dreamcast collection? And so on. Games deserve to be preserved at a bigger scale outside of illegal emulation, and backwards compatibility needs to reach beyond just a couple of generations. Even as a retro fan, projects like the Mega Drive Mini 2 or the NES Championship don't cut it anymore.